thinking of
Yeah.
Thank you. And our final question in the formal run is from Lord Alton. David.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses this morning. Can I move you on slightly from the nuclear to the chemical, radiological, and the biological threats that we face? And I suppose these are not exactly theoretical. We've seen over the weekend reports about the use of phosphorus bombs being dropped on the final group of people trying to fight for Mariupol in Ukraine. But we've also seen the use of sarin in our own country, in Salisbury, and the attacks here that on Putin's opponents in Russia. The integrated review states, and I quote, that there's an increased likelihood of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attack by the end of 2030. And that, again, I quote, there's a realistic possibility that state sponsorship of terrorism and the use of proxies will increase. And that would include a CBRN dimension. Can I ask you how severe you think that access to this threat actually is? How prepared is the United Kingdom to respond? And are the appropriate responses military, or are they non-military, or a combination of both? Thank you.
So that's a huge question. If I can just very technically, white phosphorus is not a chemical weapon. It doesn't fall under
not covered by the convention, and I was going to ask you that as a supplementary, so perhaps you could unpack that for us a bit.
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about it is that chemical weapons are agents that act through poison or toxic effects, and white phosphorus is a burning agent. So in the same way that napalm is not considered a chemical weapon, white phosphorus is not. So in terms of the likelihood of a CBRN terrorist attack, I think it's useful to think about this both in terms of the motivation necessary to carry out such an attack and the capability to do so. So I think it is possible to argue that motivation may have increased due to recent examples of chemical weapons use in Syria, in assassination attempts, etc. It's also possible to argue that non-state actor capability to carry out such attacks may increase due to trends in technology. However, overall, I don't think that the threat of CBRN terrorism has changed significantly. And this is simply because non-state actors can still get more bang for their buck, if you will, through non-CBRN attacks. It also remains the case that it is not in the interest of states to sponsor CBRN terrorism. This is the case for two reasons. First, any attack by a non-state actor could be traced back to the state sponsor, and the state sponsor would then be held liable for the attack. Second, states don't tend to like to lose control of their CBRN capabilities. Putting these capabilities into the hands of non-state actors would be a loss of control, and there's always a possibility that those actors could turn the weapons against the state that gave them to them. In terms of the required response, detection and attribution capabilities remain key to the deterrence and response to possible CBRN attacks. The ability to counter misinformation in this area is also vitally important, as we've seen most recently in Ukraine. The UK has played an important role in supporting and enabling work on the investigation and attribution of chemical attacks and in countering misinformation, and it's important that the UK maintains and develops these capabilities. If I can just add one side note on a possible biological attack, in addition to detection and attribution, the other key for preparing for a biological attack, as well as the other types of attacks, is a strong public health service that can help to identify and treat unusual disease outbreaks. With the COVID pandemic, governments have gained experience in this area. We've all seen the importance of public health and strong healthcare systems. As part of the response to the possible use of biological weapons, it's important that we learn lessons from COVID and maintain and strengthen capabilities in public health and in the NHS.
Well, can I pursue you further, if I may, for a moment on white phosphorus? Because I've raised this issue before. In fact, I raised it with the authorities in The Hague, why it isn't covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention. And given that we've seen it used against civilian populations in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also in northeast Syria by Turkey, a NATO country, I visited refugee camps there in 2019 and heard first-hand accounts of how it burnt people alive. Should it not be covered by the convention? And perhaps while you're responding to that as well, there were reports over the weekend about what happened to our own servicemen and American servicemen and women in the Gulf War in 1991 after the bombing of the caches of chemical weapons held by Iraq and the escape of chemicals during that period, which have led to long-term fatigue, to memory loss, to chronic pain, to Gulf War syndrome. And I wonder what study you've made of that and whether that's something more that we should be doing something about.
I mean, on the white phosphorus, I mean, use of white phosphorus against civilians would be considered a war crime, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it should fall under the Convention on Chemical Weapons Conventions. The Chemical Weapons Convention has a very strict definition that was carefully negotiated. This issue was looked at in the negotiations, but smoke weapons, which are used for lots of purposes, legitimate purposes, but can be misused if they're dropped directly on either armed forces or civilians. They're problematic, but that doesn't make them a chemical weapon, unfortunately. On Gulf War syndrome, yeah, I've just had in my inbox a new study on some of the things that veterans are suffering from the Gulf War. There is a definite problem there. I'm not an expert on it, and it's really, I think, at this point, the Chemical Weapons Convention is still strong, and most states do not hold chemical weapons. If the UK goes into conflicts with states that may have those, it will be important for the UK to think about not only how to destroy whatever chemical weapons exist there, but to protect servicemen and civilians in the area from any release of agents when that destruction takes place.
Were we wrong not to recognise the red line when it appeared in Syria? What do you mean by recognize the red line? Should we have intervened militarily because of chemical weapons use? We said there was a red line which should not be crossed, and yet it was crossed, and we did nothing about it.
No, I don't think it's fair to say that there was no response to the chemical weapons use in Syria. There was a very strong international diplomatic response. There was a very strong response in terms of economic sanctions. There was huge coordination between the UK and countries in Europe. There are continuing efforts to bring people who were involved in the use of chemical weapons in Syria to prosecution for war crimes. So I think there has been a very strong response. It wasn't necessarily sufficient to end the use of chemical weapons in Syria, but it may very well have acted to contain that use.
Thank you very much indeed. And